The Legion drifted through space. A giant hulk. The ship was dead. It had been for years. And the Prometheus was hoping there were still valuables on board. Drifting quietly, the mixed crew were counting down as the captain timed the thrusters just right to bring it up against the hull's edge, and the magnetic clamps clamped on and locked the two ships together. The Prometheus was tiny compared to the giant hulk of the Legion. The Legion had been an Imperial carrier, and there could be much to be found and make money from. This was outside of what the crew of the Prometheus usually went for. Usually, they just smuggled a bit of contraband here and there and appeared to do regular cargo freights. But this was a new option for them. This they had found while they floated, and this could bring them into the big time. The airlock clamped against the outside, and then Artus got... Okay, you got me, Tootie. Got the cutter out and went down and slowly went cutting away the outside of the ship until he could force a hole through. There was still pressure inside, but the crew were still going to wear suits. Lanai was staying on board to pilot the ship, but the rest gradually filed in, taking weapons with them just in case, though most of them were just low-power las pistols. They opened up and gradually floated, because there was no gravity, in to the well of the giant hulk. As they moved through, all they could see was what shone in the beams of light that came from the top of their helmets. All they could hear was the crackling of their own comms and the breathing as they moved through. You two. The ship was dark, and you could feel the vibrations through it as the great mass creaked and groaned, complaining about the new weight added onto the side of it. They weren't going to lie. It was spooky and it was unnerving. But as they went, they activated the magnetic clamps on their feet and attached to what was supposed to be the floor of the wreck, and began slowly picking their way through. The ship had been lost ages beyond time ago. No one knew how old it was or how long it had been out there. They had no map, they had no blueprint. They just had to work through, aiming to head towards the centre, where you were more likely to get control rooms, arsenals, and any of the interesting things that could be found on a ship this old. There were doors on each side, and at one point they realised that some of them were crew quarters. They opened up, cutting open the door, because with no power, there was no other choice. Inside, who knew what crew member had been in there? There were clothes, there were bundles, there was what looked like some kind of gaming machine. They looked through. There might be some money. It was out of date, but technology had been different back then. They could sell it as a relic. They summoned their little robot that looked like a small robot dinosaur, but its shape meant it was good for carrying, and they slotted that in, going through the cartridges of the console. Sexy zombie robot strippers versus alien robot cowboys came up, and they shook their head. What crazy things had they had to play back then? But it all went and slid in. The robot had plenty of space to carry. They continued to move their way through the ship. It creaked and groaned, and there were holes in sections where either time had or something had corroded away the material. A quick deactivation and float took them over most problems, but they started to get uneasy feelings as they moved through. It was almost as though they could hear something through their radios, something trying to talk to them, but that was impossible. The ship was dead. Something moved off to the right. They turned. It seemed to scuttle away. They weren't certain what could live in vacuum, what could be out here. Drawing closer together, they pulled their weapons and continued their way through. The groaning could be felt, and it felt almost as they moved further in, they were pushing through something, and an atmosphere was starting to form, though gravity still didn't. They moved through another forced open doorway and looked in to what was a giant open area, moving to jump over the top and float down into the center. There was a large glowing object, unlike anything they'd seen before, pulsing. They backed up a bit, looking at this multicolored, pulsing, vibrating thing in awe. Without looking behind them, they moved towards the back walls. There was a scream from Aziel, and as they turned round, something had oozed from the wall, pulled round him, and was pulling him in towards it. They pulled their weapons, firing their lasers, and the lasers just seemed to get absorbed, doing nothing. They could hear Aziel screaming and crying over the radio, asking for help. Artus moved forward with the cutter, trying to cut away at the substance, but as soon as it cut through, it again moved over the top. Gradually, Aziel was choking, and his breathing became laboured as whatever was pulling him pulled against his chest. Over the radio, they could hear the crack and groan as his rib cage gave, and the final squeal and squelch as it collapsed, and his body was pulled backwards, absorbed into the strange substance on the wall. Everyone moved into the centre of the room, looking down at the floor, looking at the ceiling. The walls were pulsing more now, and they could see substances trying to move over the door they came through. They weren't trying to get out that way, but there was a large crack and break through a wall in another direction. They turned, activating the magnets, and ran with a clanking movement as the magnets engaged and disengaged, moving away from the pulsing item into the darkness and back into the unknown ship. Aziel was gone. Natalia was crying. They radioed back to the ship, but got only static. They couldn't warn Lanai what was happening there. They continued moving, thinking, how do we get back? What do we do? How do we survive and make our way out of this? With no idea, their only option was to head deeper into the ship. Obviously, what had happened to the Legion was it had found something it shouldn't. They could tell they were moving now, carefully, gradually, crouched, watching for movement, watching the walls, watching the floor. They were in what looked like more of a secure area. They came to a heavy door and knew that their cutter wouldn't work. There was a number pad on the side, and Kadok moved up, pulled out a control panel and hooked up to it. The elven man had a better knowledge of technology than any of them, and he ran through, adding a small amount of power into the circuit and the controls of the door, gradually typing. They could hear movement behind them. An artist nudged him, warning him to hurry. Sweat beaded on his forehead as gradually he tried to hack through and get the code. There was a hiss. The door pushed open into what was a small airlock. He disconnected. Everybody rushed in. Power still existing. A deep red light lighting up the airlock area. Something started hurtling down the corridor towards them. They pulled the lever. A hand pushed in and the door shut on the arm, gradually pushing into its locking position. The hand fell, limped and dead on the floor. They looked. No way out that way. The other side. Again. Kadok went and prepared to open the other door. Inside appeared to have atmosphere, despite the centuries that this hulk had floated. They moved in. It was a security area. Maybe there were weapons, maybe there was something here, maybe there was another way they could get out. They felt they must be further towards the side. There might be an option and some escape pods left. They went through and looked carefully. Finding bits and pieces, they put them into the robot. The robot's eyes glowed in the dark. The beams that were the ranging sensors came out of it. Sadly, no damage could be done, but they looked cool. But in this, they just looked even more scary. This had been a mistake. The door, with runes written across it, but looking heavy and secure, could only be the armory. Again, Kadok got his device. There was some power to this area, so he didn't have to supply the power. He managed to hack in. The systems were old and antiquated, and the door slowly slipped open. They'd struck gold dust. It was the armory. There were large, heavy slug firers, bolt guns from the look of them, old and antiquated, but still heavy duty, and would put out far more power than their little lasers would. They all got some spare ammo, got the heavy weapons, heavier than they were used to, a bit big for them, and stuck clips in, ready to go. In the corner was a small box with runes that they couldn't see a way to open. It had a strange greenish tint to it, and the runes seemed to move uncomfortably. They grabbed it and put it into the robot, not knowing what it was. Running as they heard rattling coming from the airlock that they'd come through, they moved as suddenly it burst open, and dead creatures, they could see part of the skeletons still wearing their old uniforms, came pushing, stumbling towards them. The crew of the Prometheus turned, running down the corridor, opening fire, feeling the heavy kick, which, with the lack of gravity, pushed them back along the corridor as physics asserted its command. When the ammunition hit, the skeletons burst. It was more effective than their puny lasers could ever have been. They turned, all running, heading towards the back wall. They could see an emergency hatchway. It was hand opened. They cranked it open, pulled it, and could see a long narrow corridor that could only go to space, and hopefully to an escape pod. The robot ran first, and the others shuffled in, pulling tight and closing the door behind them. They ran, thinking of poor Aziel and how he had died, but that was gone now. They ran back, further down the corridor, the shadows morphing round them, almost trying to reach tentacles out to grab them. They ducked as the ship seemed to be attacking them itself, got to the end, and finally found the hatch. There was no power to the escape pod, but it was there. They pulled it open, piled in, hoping that the emergency breaching charges would fire. There were 5 heavy-duty explosive bolts in place, and they gradually ran them home as something came screaming down the corridor and was ripping at the hatch as they tried to pull it. They moved back, strapped themselves into the sides, and pulled the ripcord that triggered the bolts. Nothing happened. The banging kept going on the back of the escape pod, and they could feel it starting to buckle. Panicking, K-Doc went back. He could see the wire missing, reached, and then as he put it in place, was pushed, slammed against the back wall as all of the bolts triggered, pushing the escape pod away and into space. As it cleared the hulk of the Legion, gradually they found that they had communication again. They paused and put a call in. The Prometheus disconnected and floated over the top. Pulling on the back, they could open the airlock after the 2 bonded, and the bedraggled crew pulled the robot and what they had discovered into their little ship, discarding the escape pod and hoping to forget. They engaged their engines and headed into the dark. Lanai, looking nervously, as something seemed to appear just on the back of the radar, as though something had just come into the area through warp. They settled down and prayed they had made it safely away. How was that? You got your bolt guns? I hope you enjoyed it anyway. Too many bolt guns. You spend weeks asking me for more bolt guns. I give you bolt guns and there are too many. Oh, hello Dean. Welcome. Sadly, you got here just as we came to the end, but go back to the beginning and catch up. There was a good story. As I said at the beginning, I'm going to cut off the chat bit when YouTube lets me tomorrow. Oh, hi Kate. Haven't seen you in here before. I'm almost relieved it's this time that you managed to get here. The nightmare that you could have given me during it, I hate to think, and I'm sure I would thoroughly deserve it. Kate, for anyone that wonders, is a player of Arkham Horror with my wife on the channel Canje Studios, usually at 2 o'clock on a Sunday. I strongly suggest everybody goes and watches it. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. If you haven't liked, please do so. Sorry. Remember to click the bell so that you get notifications. And remember that we have the Eldritch Order, our Patreon, and that gives you a chance to actually help plan and work out how these streams are going to continue and develop. I've got all sorts of ideas. Most of them need more people involved earlier, especially for the longer Sunday streams, when I'm thinking of doing things like getting groups of pictures sent in advance and then using those pictures to help create the story, as well as working with frameworks. So come along, join the Eldritch Order, and for now, farewell. But remember, avoid unknown ships in the dark, for you never know what you may find on board.